Before we begin, this story includes a wartime sinking, mass drowning, shark attacks, and many years later, a death by suicide. If any of that is something you need to step away from, we understand. Take care of yourself first. This episode's narration is AI generated. The research, writing, and editorial decisions behind every story are made with care for accuracy and respect for those involved. The third morning, the sun came up the way it had the 2 mornings before, flat and white over a calm sea, and no land anywhere. Sergeant Edgar Harrell hung in a waterlogged life jacket, his face and arms black with fuel oil, his lips split open from the salt. Around him, in loose clusters across the water, were hundreds of men. Some were praying, some were already gone, held up only by their jackets. A few had started swimming toward an island that wasn't there. Harrell kept watching the horizon for a ship. He'd been watching for almost 3 days. No ship was coming. And not because the Navy had searched the sea and missed them, because the United States Navy did not yet know that the Indianapolis was gone. You're listening to the Unlit Room. Every story in here actually happened. That's the part that should scare you. New stories every day, Monday through Saturday. Today, a warship that finished the most important mission of the war, and then sank in 12 minutes, while the men who survived waited 4 days for a rescue that arrived by accident. Go back 2 weeks, July 16, 1945, Mare Island Navy Yard, just north of San Francisco. The air smells of fuel oil and cutting torch smoke. Just after 8 in the morning, under armed Marine Guard, 2 men carry a heavy padlocked canister up the gangway of the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis. It's about the size of a garbage can, olive drab, and it's heavy enough that both men strain under the weight. A second item, a tall wooden crate, is swung aboard by crane and welded directly to the deck plates of the passageway outside the captain's quarters. The captain is Charles McVeigh III, a decorated officer from a Navy family. He's told only that the cargo is of the utmost importance. And he's told one more thing. If the ship goes down, the cargo comes off first, before the lifeboats, before the crew. Nobody aboard, not even McVeigh, is told what's inside. What's inside is the war. Locked in that canister is the enriched uranium core for the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima. The crate holds assembly components for the same weapon. The Indianapolis is carrying the heart of the most secret project in American history, and not one sailor on the ship knows it. She runs for the Western Pacific almost flat out. On July 26th, she reaches the island of Tin Ian in the Marianas in record transit time. The cargo is lifted off and signed for. The mission is complete. By any measure, the men have just pulled off one of the most important deliveries of the entire war. They're never told that either. 2 days later, on July 28th, the Indianapolis leaves Tinian and sails toward Leyte Gulf in the Philippines for routine crew training before the planned invasion of Japan. She sails alone. No destroyer escort is assigned to screen her for submarines. She is a single large warship, unescorted, moving through open water that is not as empty as the Navy believes. Here is the shape of what's coming. The reward for finishing the most important mission of the war was not a medal or a parade or even a thank you. The reward was the next 4 days. Secrecy this complete has a strange afterlife. For decades, the men who delivered the bomb's core couldn't be honored for it, because the mission was classified. And many of them didn't fully understand what they'd carried until long after the war. They had done something enormous, in total ignorance of what it was. That gap between the act and the knowing runs through this whole story. Just past midnight, in the dark water off the starboard bow, something appeared that no one on watch had time to name. 14 minutes after midnight, July 30th, a moonless night. The sea was black and calm, and the Indianapolis was running at 17 knots with most of her crew asleep. A Japanese submarine, designated I-58, under Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, had her in its sights. Hashimoto fired 2 torpedoes, both struck. The first tore off the bow, 65 feet of the front of the ship, simply gone. The second detonated amidships and ignited the aviation fuel stored below. A column of orange fire climbed several hundred feet into the night. Men asleep in their bunks were thrown to the deck. Survivors described waking to water that was ankle-deep, then waist-deep, in the space of seconds. There was no time to sound general quarters. There was barely time to understand what was happening. The torn open bow acted like a scoop, driving the sea into the ship faster than any pump could answer. Roughly 12 minutes after the torpedoes hit, the Indianapolis rolled hard to starboard and went under. About 300 men died with her or in the explosions. Close to 890 others were thrown or jumped into the Philippine Sea. And then the ship was gone, and the fires were gone, and there was nothing on the surface but oil, debris, and men. The Navy that owned them did not know any of it had happened. The Indianapolis had a scheduled arrival. She was due at Leyte Gulf. There was an office there whose job was to track ships in and out. Everything you'd need to notice that a cruiser was missing existed: the schedule, the paperwork, the people. On paper, the system worked. That's the part worth sitting with for a moment. Because on July 31st, the Indianapolis didn't arrive at Leyte, and a duty officer noticed, and then he went home. Here is the failure that cost the most lives. In the summer of 1945, the Navy had no standing rule requiring a combatant ship to report its safe arrival. Non-arrival by itself triggered nothing. So when the Indianapolis failed to reach Leyte, the officer who logged it assumed she'd been diverted, filed the note, and let it go. No alarm, no search. No one was looking for almost 900 men because no rule told anyone they were missing. Out on the water, those men were running out of time in every direction at once. The Kai-Pok life jackets, the standard issue filled with a fibrous plant material called Kai-Pok, were never built to float a man for days. Soaked through, they slowly lost their buoyancy and began to pull their wearers down. Men with no fresh water cracked apart under the sun. By the second and third day, some were drinking seawater, and the salt drove them into hallucination. They saw islands. They saw the ship below them intact, with fresh water just a dive away. Some swam down to find it and never came back up. And the sharks came the first night. Oceanic whitetips, drawn by the blood and the thrashing, circling the clusters of men, most active at dawn and dusk. Officers like Ensign Harlan Twible swam from group to group, trying to hold the men together, trying to keep them from drifting off alone, because alone was where the sharks took you. 84 hours. That's how long they were in the water. Nearly 4 full days, while the institution responsible for them carried on as if nothing had happened. When the country finally reckoned with what happened, 2 very different explanations took shape, and the argument between them still hasn't fully closed. The first is the Navy's own position from 1945. The service held that Captain McVeigh bore command responsibility for hazarding his ship, specifically by failing to zigzag, the standard evasive maneuver meant to throw off a submarine's aim. Doctrine of the day held that zigzagging reduced a ship's vulnerability, and McVeigh's orders left the choice to his discretion. By that account, the fault sat with the man on the bridge. The second explanation, argued by survivors' groups, by historians like Doug Stanton, and ultimately by congressional investigators decades later, says the real failure was systemic. According to this view, 3 separate commands received signals related to the Indianapolis and her movements, and none acted, because no single protocol required any of them to. The disaster in this reading wasn't one man's mistake. It was a machine built so that no one in particular was ever responsible. Both accounts fit the facts, and only one of them could be put on trial. The rescue, when it finally came by accident. Late on the morning of August 2nd, a Navy pilot named Wilbur Gwynn was flying a routine anti-submarine patrol in a Ventura patrol plane. A trailing radio antenna had jammed, and Gwynn leaned to look down at it, and saw, stretching across the blue water far below, a long dark stain. An oil slick. He descended to look closer. At first he took what he saw for a large school of fish. Lower still, the shapes became men, floating, waving. Gwynn radioed it in immediately, and aircraft and ships began converging. Seaplane crews did something they were explicitly told never to do. They landed on the open ocean in the swells to start pulling men out of the water one at a time. The first rescuers hauled up survivors who weighed as little as 90 pounds. Men so far gone they couldn't grip a ladder and had to be lifted bodily. Of the roughly 890 who'd entered the water, 317 came out alive. The men had not been searched for, they had been found. 3 months later, the United States Navy finally held someone accountable for the worst loss of life at sea in its history. It was the captain who survived. McVeigh was court-martialed in the winter of 1945 for hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag. And in one of the strangest moments in American military justice, the Navy called the enemy as a witness. Mochitsu Ra-hashi Moto, the Japanese commander who had sunk the Indianapolis, crossed the Pacific to testify. Under oath in an American courtroom, he told the court that zigzagging would have made no difference. He'd had the ship in his sights, he would have hit her anyway. McVeigh was convicted regardless. The sentence was later set aside by Fleet Admiral Nimitz and the Secretary of the Navy, and McVeigh stayed in the Navy and retired as a Rear Admiral, but the verdict followed him out the door. For the next 23 years, the families of dead crewmen sent him letters holding him personally responsible for their sons' deaths. On the morning of November 6, 1968, Charles McVeigh was found dead at his home in Connecticut. He had taken his own life. He was 70 years old. In his hand, he was holding a small metal toy sailor. In October of the year 2000, 32 years after his death, Congress passed a resolution exonerating him, and the Navy amended his record. In 2017, the wreck of the Indianapolis was finally located more than 18,000 feet down on the floor of the Philippine Sea. When an institution fails on this scale, it seems to need a name to pin the failure to. And the man standing on the ship is always more visible than the rule that nobody wrote. The protocol that failed to notice a missing cruiser had no face. The chain of commands that each received a signal and did nothing had no single author. So the Navy reached for the one person it could see, the captain who lived, and made him carry it. The enemy submarine commander crossed an ocean to say McVeigh was not at fault. His own country didn't extend him that same clarity until he had been dead for more than 3 decades. 879 men died in that water. The last of them, in a sense, died in Connecticut in 1968, holding a toy sailor 23 years after the ship went down. If this one kept you up tonight, good. New stories every day, Monday through Saturday. Subscribe so the next one finds you too. Follow the Unlit Room wherever you listen. Tell a friend who can't sleep. Full story on the main channel. Follow if you're wide awake. That was the Unlit Room. See you in the dark.